of the collection when it opened in 1971 at the Metropolitan Toronto Central Library on St. George Street. So if you want to come up, and this is Cameron, and this button was, we used to hand out, this is the Sherlock Holmes is alive and well and living at the Central Library, which I think we've translated to this building. In 2002, Cameron had passed away the year before. To honor his memory, we established an annual lecture to celebrate and remember Cameron's career, and this is the 23rd consecutive one. It was interrupted by, not interrupted, but displaced from this room for a few years during COVID when we just did it online. But I think bums and seats is much better, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. So we were formed in 1997 by a small group who wanted to find a formal way to help the collection to grow and to become an even more valuable resource for Conan Doyle scholars, for the library, and for the City of Toronto. We're an unincorporated organization that works with the Toronto Public Library Foundation, which provides us with a home and a great deal of support. And when you make your donations to the Friends, they actually go to the foundation, which manages our money, so I'm not tempted. We also have, for any Americans, we have the American Foundation for the Toronto Public Library, which is a US 501c3, equivalent of a registered charity in Canada. So Americans who want to make tax beneficial donations to us can do that through the American Friends, and frankly, they have helped us a lot with some of the things that we've been able to purchase. We work with the library to enhance the collection. We act as a resource for the library on issues that may come up. Some of us have expertise in areas that are not normally found within the library, although I must say the curators seem to have at least as much as most of us, and maybe more. We raise money to purchase, and I think Jesse will tell you, our curator will tell you about some of those. We work to raise public consciousness of the collection, and we act as a resource together with the library staff in dealing with other public and private collections. And the most visible result of this, of course, is the wonderful art project on Sherlock Holmes Walk. I know some of you were here for the indoor version of the tour when it proved to be like too Canadian weather out there for an outdoors version. But when this is over, I'm urging you to either, or do both, go out and have a look at the walk from beginning to end if you haven't already done it, to see the wonderful artwork, and go upstairs to the collection and you can have an informal tour of the collection with our curator, Jesse. We work with the Bootmakers of Toronto, which is the local Sherlock Holmes Society, and we work with other organizations worldwide to promote the appreciation of Arthur Conan Doyle and his work. We're one of the few societies in the world. There's Sherlock Holmes societies everywhere in almost every continent, in almost every language that you can imagine. But we're one of the few that's dedicated to Arthur Conan Doyle rather than his most famous creation. And our members come from literally all over the world. So among our activities, we publish 3 issues of our magazine, our newsletter, The Magic Door, each year. And the current issue of The Magic Door is actually now being prepared and it'll be published in a few days. If you want to take away, those are samples. They're not the more recent issues, but those are samples of some of the issues of Magic Door, which if you'll have a look at it, it's a very high quality publication. And it'll give you more information. And if you're interested in joining the Friends, it'll tell you how you can do that too. And I want to thank our editor, Tom Yu, who has maintained the high standards that readers have come to expect. Each fall, we publish the previous year's annual Hall-Year lecture, and we send it all out to our members. In December, subject to the end of the postal strike, which is not guaranteed, we'll be sending out our 2023 lecture by Dana Richards, The Fires of Fate, a morality play that is bad medicine. And today's lecture is going to be published next year. Since 2020, our lectures have been recorded, as this one will be, and you can watch them on our YouTube channel. And to find out any of these things that we do or how to connect to them, you just go to our webpage and there'll be links to virtually everything. So our webpage is acdfriends, pretty simple, .org. we help the collection to purchase items which are not within its budget. We've purchased or contributed to the purchase of several very important additions to the collection, and we're always interested in receiving gifts or bequests for which the foundation can issue a charitable receipt. So I'm very excited that yesterday we had the formal dedication and the ribbon cutting, and I forgot to bring the ribbon, but it's in my box somewhere. Actually, if you want to show it. It was cut in 20 places, so the part I got was fairly small. There were 20 scissors out there. I'm not exaggerating. Mine was big enough to be an offensive weapon in a war. And it will be on a video we'll post. And this is going to the collection. As a matter of fact, I'll see that it gets there right now. So we want to specifically thank Street Art Toronto, which is the arm of the City of Toronto that makes sure that there's art in all kinds of public places, which results in a much cleaner and friendlier and more interesting city. Bridge underpasses, walkways, new buildings have to comply with the requirements to have public art on them or art projects. So they're a wonderful group of people to work with. And I especially want to mention the curator who worked with us on it, Anne-Marie Power, who did a spectacular job. She created the theme for the first phase. She found the artists. She mentored the artists so that their choices of what to paint and what to put up on the wall was relevant to Conan Doyle and made sense. And as I said, I hope you'll walk through it if you can't. If you haven't seen it already, I hope you'll walk through it before you leave today. We also work with the American Foundation for the Toronto Public Library. We offer our American friends the opportunity to receive charitable tax treatment for their gifts to support the collection. Wanted to thank the past president of that foundation, Glenn Moranker, who's helped us with several major manuscript purchases. And I also want to thank Les Klinger, who is probably the world's leading annotator of other people's work, the annotated Sherlock Holmes, the annotated Dracula, the annotated, help me out, Les. Sandman, right. Yeah. He's helped us, and he's always supportive. And finally, I want to thank the members of our executive who work behind the scenes to carry out our activities. So our website at www.acdfriends.org is maintained by Doug Elliott, who manages to keep it up to date from his home in Sydney, Australia. Doug's retiring shortly, and we need a volunteer to take over. So if any of you are skilled with websites or know someone who would be interested in volunteering, it's not a huge job. We don't have that many postings, like a couple of postings a month, but definitely it would be very nice, and if you know someone, please get in touch with me. You can send it to chairman@acdfriends.org, and that's on our website as well. Our vice chair, Barbara Rush, who's here today and will conduct the question and answer period. Our secretary and merchandise chair, Philip Elliott, who's here today and will have a small role to play. Our treasurer, Peter Chant, and our membership secretary, Kathy Burns, who I don't see today. Tom Yu, our Magic Door editor, and Mike Ranieri, who's the head of the Bootmakers of Toronto, who helps us in many ways, including graphic design. And finally, but thank you to the Toronto Public Library Foundation, especially Will Scott, its president, Lisa Fernandez, who spoke to you, and for all of their hardworking staff, for all the material support and encouragement they give us, and it is very much appreciated. And finally, thank you to the special collections staff who are responsible for the wonderful Arthur Conan Doyle Collection, Allison Lennox, who spoke to you before, who's the manager of special collections, and our former curator, Peggy Perdue, who can't be here today, but she's now the senior department head of special collections, so we haven't lost her. We just moved her to the side where she's still a very valuable resource. Did I get her title right, or she put? Oh yeah, she's got a new title, but she's still involved. And our curator, who's going to speak to you next, Jessie Amalo, for the enthusiasm and skill, and I do mean that. She brings to her position every day, and you're going to hear from her in a minute. And you can visit us on our Facebook page. So if you are on Facebook, and you can just put in Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection, you'll find us. We always have a lively discussion or two, and we have a YouTube channel where all of our previous lectures and some other interesting talks are posted. Again, you can find it on our webpage. And this lecture as well, once it's been recorded and posted by the library, we'll have a link to it on there as well. And I invite you to consider becoming a member. And you can find all the information on our website and click on Become a Friend. And you can also find us from the link on our Facebook page. And now I'd like to introduce to you our curator, Jesse Amalo.
Hello everyone. So it has been a while since we've met in person. It's so great to see you all here. I'm sure most of you know me, but for those who don't, my name is Jesse Amalo, and I am Services Specialist and Curator of the Toronto Public Library's Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some interesting and notable items acquired for the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection this past year. I will start with a very exciting item acquired earlier in the year with significant contribution from the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. The item is an extremely scarce first edition in book form, second impression of A Study in Scarlet, Conan Doyle's first Sherlock Holmes story. This 1888 edition follows the first printing of A Study in Scarlet in Beaton's Christmas Annual from 1887 and is of particular interest as it is the only edition featuring 6 illustrations by the author's father. Charles Altamont Doyle. Also, this copy, as confirmed through the bookplate, was once owned by influential Sherlockian Lord Donegal, former editor of the London Sherlock Holmes Society. I had known about this item since my early days of being a curator after having read about its significance in 17 Steps to a Sherlock Holmes Collection, a paper written in 1986 by founding curator of the collection, Cameron Hollier. In it, he notes that the edition is so scarce that we would likely never be able to obtain a copy, so I am so pleased to report that we were able to secure one for the collection and fill this long-standing gap. Yay! Just a few other exciting, notable acquisitions. We purchased 2 early annotated treatment type scripts for the 1929 film The Return of Sherlock Holmes by uncredited screenwriters Oliver H.P. Garrett and F. Hugh Hubert. Although some key characters are missing from these scripts, the final plot of the film is quite different. Some elements of these scripts can be seen in the film's final release. We purchased a 1907 first UK edition of The Secret of Moor Cottage by H. Ripley Cromash. This is a mystery story written by Arthur Conan Doyle's sister, Brian Mary Doyle, under the pen name H. Ripley Cromash, described by the vendor as an accomplished Gothic-tinged crime novel involving a lonely house and a mysterious death of a countess, narrated from 2 perspectives. It was the second and last novel published by Arthur Conan Doyle's younger sister and is rarely seen for sale. We also purchased 2 fine press books from Armenthine Books, produced in 2023 in Croatia, including The Essential Edition of Sherlock Holmes and The Adventure of a Dozen Favorites, a short story collection featuring Conan Doyle's 12 favorite short stories, limited to 400 copies, and the Detective Edition, limited to 200 copies. Each features its own design elements, spine engravings, bound in the finest materials and fabrics, and signed by the creator and illustrator. We also purchased the recent editions of the Edinburgh University Press works of Arthur Conan Doyle, including Round the Red Lamp from 2023 and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes from 2024. These editions are scholarly editions covering the author's entire career. And finally, 2 Easton Press fine leather-bound editions, Sherlock Holmes, The Complete Novels from 2022 and Ghostly Stories from 2017, featuring the captain of the Pole Star. If you're interested in seeing any of these items or other rare treasures from the collection, I would invite you to join me in visiting the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection after the lecture today, located on the 5th floor of the library in the Marilyn and Charles Bailey Special Collection Center. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie. If you ask Jessie nicely when you go up there, she might be willing to show you the Beaton's Christmas Annual, which is the first Sherlock Holmes story that was owned by one of the senior officers of the American Sherlock Holmes Society, Edgar Smith, and it's very valuable, so she won't let you hold it. I always cringe when she takes it out to make sure that no one... So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ray Betzner. And before I do that, I just mention that because this lecture is being recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, eventually there will be time for Q&A at the end. And if you ask a question, you're agreeing that your voice, but not your image, can appear in the final. And we'll remind you that again at the end. So Ray Betzner is a lifelong Sherlockian, and that means he's someone who discusses, debates, and takes delight in the original 60 stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle about Sherlock fans. And I might also add, we play Sherlockians, we play the game. Sherlock Holmes is alive. As a matter of fact, he's still alive because his obituary has never appeared in the New York Times or the London Times. So we know he's still alive. He's also a fan of Vincent Starrett, the book collector, poet, columnist, and detective story writer, whose 1933 work, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, kicked off a wave of Holmes idolatry that is yet to subside. Ray edited the 75th anniversary edition of Starrett's seminal volume. He was made a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, the Sherlock Holmes Society of the United States, in 1887, and everybody gets a name, and his is the Agony Column. I don't really understand that, but it must have something to do with your career. You'll probably get asked in the question period. And he has discussed Starrett and Holmes at events through the United States and also now Canada. If this topic interests you, Ray has a blog, Studies in Starrett. It's hard to remember. It's www.vincentstarrett.com. So it should be easy to remember. And Ray's a retired higher education marketing and communications expert. He lives with his wife Joan in Williamsburg, Virginia, with their cantankerous cat. And I find it hard to believe, but only several hundred books. I have a feeling he's being modest. So his topic today is Born in a Toronto Bookshop, Vincent Starrett, and the World of Sherlock Holmes. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ray Betzner.
We have a cantankerous cat. His name is Jesse. All due deference. He is 17 years old. He gets us up every morning at 4 a.m. to remind us that he's going to need to be fed every 2 or 3 hours during the course of the day. He is not interested in Sherlock Holmes. I know this because he comes up to the little room that I have, my office, where I keep my books, and he immediately jumps up into the chair and falls asleep. Thank you so much for coming out today on a cold day. I really do appreciate it. And I especially want to thank Cliff and the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection for this invitation. It means a huge amount to me. I met Cameron Holyer 40 years ago, back in the days when it was still the Metropolitan Toronto Library at a different location. The room was a very small and different room. Cameron was, I was a budding Sherlock Holmes Conan Doyle fan in those days, and Cameron was generous and kind. He gave me a huge amount of his time. He was very, very thoughtful, and I am grateful to this day. He was also justly proud of the collection, and I'm sure he would be enormously proud to see how it has evolved in the days since he left us. So, oh, wait, there's other things I meant to do. I'm sorry. Want to also thank a couple of people who I got in touch with several months ago. who've been enormously helpful to me in finding out a lot about Vincent Starrett's maternal family, the Young family. You'll hear the Young name a great deal during the course of this talk. Nancy Mollett and Anne McColmson. Would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. So some of the photos you've seen have come from them. Some of the information you'll hear has come from them. Want to make it very clear, if I got anything wrong, I screwed up. They did not, okay? Don't blame them. It was my fault. I've been asked today to talk about Vincent Starrett, his relationship to Toronto, and the influence this city had on his long and fruitful life. As you'll learn, it was the experiences Starrett had here that helped shape his views about the two topics that occupied his mind for most of his 87 years, books and reading and Sherlock Holmes. So I know some of you might know a little bit about Starrett. Some of you might know a little bit about this whole goofy world of Sherlock Holmes that you've heard a little bit about. If you have questions, please hang on to them. Be happy to answer any questions that you have at the end of the talk. So let's get started. And the first slide is wrong. So I have his address listed as number 26 Oxford Street. That is the address Vincent lists in his autobiography as his birth address. But Philip, it was actually what? There you go. Yeah, so that shows you how much you can trust Vincent Starrett when he's writing about a number of things. I'm writing a biography of Vincent Starrett right now, and I've discovered that you need to go behind him and check things out because his heart was in the right place, but his notes often were a mess. This is how 26 Oxford Street looks today. Whether this was actually his house or not, it really doesn't matter. Sometimes people come up to me and they say, was Vincent Starrett really born in a bookshop? Well, why would you ask that question? It's because that's what he told us. This is his autobiography. It's called Born in a Bookshop. The original title was The Somnambulist and the Detective. That will really fly off the shelves, won't it? Yes, sir. Born in a Bookshop was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 1965. He started writing that book in the 1950s. It grew to be so huge that no publisher wanted to take it. He eventually had to cut it down quite a bit. But this is the volume. You'll see a lot of quotes from me today. I'll be quoting largely from Vincent's autobiography. The first will be the story of Vincent Starrett's birth. Vincent loved telling this story. The story got better over the years as he told it over and over. He especially loved to tell it when he was at a table that may have had some beverages associated with it, but certainly had writers or editors or newspaper reporters there, and you'll find out why. He says, a natural storyteller, it says, it appears that when I was born, I was so impassive and improbable a specimen of the human animal that I was written off as dead on arrival. As my mother's life was in some danger, my supposedly lifeless carcass was wrapped in a convenient newspaper and thrust under the bed to be disposed of at greater leisure. Subsequent inquiry by the physician in charge revealed the pleasing fact, since verified, that I was not dead at all, but living, albeit feebly and with difficulty. Vincent would wait until the chuckling around the table was done, lean back, light up his cigar, and he would say, "Can any of my colleagues of the typewriter point to an earlier appearance in print?" For a boy with his head either in a book or in the clouds, it wasn't hard for Charlie. That's what his name was as a child here in Toronto. For Charlie Starrett to look around Toronto in the late 1800s and imagine it was the London of Sherlock Holmes. Lamplighters could still be seen every dusk sparking gassy flames, while hansom cabs and horse-drawn trolley cars rattled down the cobblestone roads of Ontario's provincial capital. Both the gas lamps and the horse-drawn carriages would soon be replaced in the new century, but for the young Starrett, the city captured a romance that he would remember for the rest of his life. The best show was when one of the city's regiments was on parade. Here's what he said about it. One or another of the gorgeous regiments always seemed to be on view. There were drills, parades, jubilee celebrations, and similar spectacles that can only be described as tremendous. The bands played, the pipes skirled, the tartans blew in the breeze. It was altogether one small boy's idea of a perfect universe. That one small boy was Vincent Starrett. Now, again, Charlie to his family here in Toronto. So when you hear me talk about Charlie Starrett, I'm talking about him as a young boy. If I talk about Starrett or Vincent Starrett, that's talking about the adult. A little confusing, you'll be able to sort it out. All right, are you ready to say, "Aww"? Yeah, I knew you would. There he is. This is the first photograph we have of Vincent Starrett. He's over, little Charlie is over there on the right-hand side. His younger brother Stanley is in the middle, and that rather angry-looking Cupid doll is Hugh Young, one of the members of the Young family. You're going to hear a lot about the Young family in the early part of this presentation. This photo, how old would you say Charlie is in this picture? Any guesses? We don't have an age, so yours is as good as a guess as mine. Yeah, Cliff, go ahead. 3 or 4, 5, yeah, 4 or 5. Yeah, I think that it was probably around 4 years of age. That was a very important age for little Charlie because his mom and dad, Charlie and his younger brother, moved from Toronto to Chicago. And you would think that that would be the end of his Toronto experience, but you would be wrong. Because every summer for the next 10 years, in other words, until he was 14 years of age, little Charlie, his brother, and then other brothers as they came along, came back to Toronto, and that's where they would spend their long summer vacations. So Toronto, for the first 14 years of Charlie's life, was a very, very important player. As the story about his being born will tell you, the Starrett family were great storytellers. Although we don't have any records of his father telling a lot of stories, we do have kind of the behavior you would associate with that coming out of this man, Polk, Robert Polk Starrett. Charlie Starrett had an Irish father, a simple, kindly, and courageous man who was obviously in his youth a hell of a fellow. Polk was named for the 11th American president, and like his namesake, he was a no-nonsense man who did not suffer fools gladly. Family legend has it that Starrett's mother and father were walking home one night, a little before midnight, with baby Charlie in their arms. A Toronto constable stopped them and demanded where they had been at that hour of the evening. Polk stopped, calmly handed Charlie to Charlie's mother, and then poked the constable right in the jaw and knocked him to the ground. He then took Charlie back, and the three of them walked home. Remembering his father, Starrett later remarked, "Kind as he was, his temper was swift and terrible, and he had a fine sense of justice that sometimes led him to take the law into his own hands, I should say so." So here is Polk again, and here is his wife, Margaret Denniston Young. Margaret, lovely young woman, Polk, handsome young man. They really are a very good-looking couple, especially for the time. Polk worked in both Toronto and Chicago as a bookkeeper. I also have to acknowledge he was also very familiar with the bottle. Polk's family was fun-loving, and from them Starrett inherited the ability to twirl any event into a little tale that would entertain the listener, even if it slipped beyond the boundaries of fact. Let's talk a little bit more about this woman. Margaret Denniston Young Starrett, one of 11 children. Vincent says about her, she had been a school teacher, a good one, I believe, but after her marriage, she devoted herself exclusively to Dad, who needed a lot of looking after. Margaret was one of 11 children, as I say, and from the family of John Young and Christina Blair Liddell Young. The Young family was large, and Charlie's aunts, uncles, and cousins could easily flesh out a baseball diamond for both teams. Starrett called the Youngs pious, God-fearing Presbyterians. For Vincent, that wasn't necessarily a compliment, I should tell you. Every day of the week blended home prayers and Bible readings. To young Charlie, Sundays at John Young's house were somber affairs, with the family rising early to get ready for church services. Even as a child, Charlie hated getting out of the bed before noon, a trait he would carry throughout the rest of his life. He especially disliked having to get up to go to church with the Youngs, whose large family could be seen quietly tromping the squares of the city like a somber version of his beloved gorgeous regiments. His mother's family was not marching off to battle, but to an early morning church service that Charlie found deadly dull. It was not that he disliked the Bible, mind you. There were many good battle stories in the Bible. And if the preacher would only spend more time on Samson and his superhuman strength, or Pharaoh chasing the Israelites across the Red Sea, Charlie might have even warmed up to going to the weekly church services. Alas, he was disappointed. As he grew up, his mother would buy Charlie religious books, hoping that they would reach the boy's soul. But the young Charlie was bored by the moralizing, and he never took to his mother's faith. But if he rejected the Young's piety, Starrett reveled in their relationship with books. His maternal grandfather, John Young, ran a bookshop in the city for the Upper Canada Bible Society and Upper Canada Tract Society. If you take a look at the ad, you'll see John Young listed as depositary. It was essentially the manager of the bookstore. Let's take a look at the outside of the bookstore. And here again, I have to thank the members of the Young family for this photo. That is, the address is 102 Young Street. The street's probably been some renumbering since then. There's some debate about exactly which of the old buildings in that area this building is. Rather than get into the debate, I just leave it at this is what it looked like. You see the upper stories there. That's where the John Young family lived. So John Young, his wife, and their 11 children lived upstairs above the bookshop. Starrett talks about it this way. It was a religious bookshop with Bibles in multiple languages and hundreds of religious tracts. Interestingly, it also carried the latest fiction and nonfiction, along with what Starrett called tables of English novels, including a line of current fiction of a sort that threatened no peril to the human soul. This might explain why a religious bookstore also had a small area stuffed with children's adventures. They were called at the time juveniles. Let's take a peek inside. So here again, this is the interior of the bookstore. Along the right-hand side is the tract side. So you see those bound volumes along the right-hand side. Those tracts would have largely been published in England and sent over to Canada. We're in Canada, not the United States, Ray. In Canada. And the tracts would have been moral stories, lectures by ministers, pastors, ways in which the Bible could be used to relate to your own life. Over on the left-hand side of the photo, those would have been the Bibles. The Bibles would have been published in a number of different languages so that it could be used by parishioners all over the province. And those tables that you see in front of you, those may well have contained the British books that had novels that, as Vincent said, posed no problem to the human soul. In the back of the bookstores, back of this bookshop, there was the children's section. That back room drew Charlie in like a lodestone. and became not only his sanctuary, but also the place where he began a lifelong love affair with books. Here's how he describes it. My happiest recollection of books is in my grandfather's shop. This is a man who was writing in the 1950s. He say it again. My happiest recollections of books is in my grandfather's shop. My particular playground was at the back, a small room given over exclusively to children's books, where on bright days the sunlight fell through a back window in a warm blaze of friendliness such as I have never experienced elsewhere. It fell across the backs of hundreds of books in red, blue, green, and gold bindings that contained, as they still do, some of the greatest stories ever written on the planet. Let's see the back room. So I took the photograph that your family gave me, and I blew it up. Over on the left-hand side, I believe that's Grandfather Young, standing at the table doing the books, and that may be his son standing on that right-hand side. This is the alcove. I'm not sure if this is the room that Charlie Starrett was in. The reason why I say that is because if you look behind that pole, there look to be two doorways there. One of those doorways may have led to essentially what was a children's room. Who knows where exactly it went to. I don't know that it exactly matches up with the description that Starrett gives us, but it's certainly the back room. He went on to describe it this way. It is impossible to describe the radiance of that little room. As the sunlight picked out the titles of books and brought out the illustrations on their spines. Soldiers, horses, cowboys, Indians, gold diggers, frigates, ships in full sail and ships sinking beneath the waves, a stirring panorama of all the traditional scenes of peril and adventure. Let's just pause for a moment. Cathedrals are described in this way. And for a better part of a decade, this little room became Charlie's true church, where he enjoyed something akin to a spiritual experience. Born in a bookshop indeed, perhaps born again in a bookshop. Notice here what he said at the very beginning of this description. My happiest recollections of books is in my grandfather's shop. He did not say, my happiest recollections of books as a child. No. He means that moment was his most fulfilling engagement with books for his entire life, and this from a man who lived to be 87 years old. Decades after leaving Toronto, Starrett would look back on the innocent days of reading for the sheer joy of adventure and surprise, and speak of it with a tender passion. This comes from an essay called Books of the Golden Age that was published in 1940. It was then possible to read with a single-minded pleasure for the story and its telling, for the sheer uncritical joy of reading. How much of that early rapture has gone with the years, I do not know, and it's a question that sometimes troubles me. Let's take a look back into the interior of the building, because it wasn't all reading and seriousness in there. Charlie was a boy, after all, and I recently learned that he was also a rather playful person here. This story comes from a 1974 letter by Rachel Albright, who served as typist and secretary for the elderly Starrett in Chicago. Starrett told her about a story about his antics there. It went like this. When Charlie and his brother Stanley visited Toronto, they liked to play pranks on the elderly gentleman who worked in Grandfather Young's bookstore. One morning, they recognized a fine chance for mischief in the men's washroom. It had johns with doors that locked on the inside and extended to the floor, but there was an opening of about a foot at the top. The boys, in much glee, entered one john after another, locking each one and then climbing out of the top. Then, intending to return an hour or so later, they departed. Well, as the morning went on, the old gentlemen from the shop were baffled every time they went to the washroom to find all the johns apparently in use. Finally, Grandfather Young himself appeared. He wasn't baffled for long. Indignantly, he cried out, "Where's Charlie?" Starrett would grow up to have a diverse career as a newspaper reporter, short story writer, novelist, poet, columnist, and the man behind literally dozens and dozens of articles on books about books. But he never left his childhood completely behind. As an adult, Starrett would hunt down the books he loved in his youth, such as the works of the prolific boys' writer G.A. Henty. Books like By Right of Conquest, With Roberts in Pretoria, With the Allies in Peking, The Treasure of the Incas, A Final Reckoning, A Tale of Bush Life in Australia, With Clive in India, With Lee in Virginia, and With Wolfe in Canada. Starrett was often broke. And he went through at least a couple of major periods where he had to sell off major portions of his book collection, almost all of it. He would turn right around and start buying these books again. How do I know that? Here's a copy of A Final Reckoning, The Tale of Bush Life in Australia from my own collection. As you can see, he purchased this on June 14th, 1949. Vincent Starrett was 63 years old, not nearly a boy anymore. Toronto influenced yet another profound aspect of young Charlie's diverse childhood reading. In the introduction to his first novel, Seaports in the Moon, Starrett says this: "When I was a small boy in my grandfather's library, history, as I read it, without a sense of time or causes, was in large part a confused and glamorous nightmare. His boyhood reading blended fictional characters with historic events until it all became deliciously scrambled. When school teachers tried to sort him out, young Charlie paid them no mind. He knew what he knew, and in his mind, Christopher Columbus must have met Don Quixote. They were equally credible subjects. Why not?" I mentioned Seaports in the Moon and wanted to take us on a little side street for just a minute. Seaports was published in 1928 by Doubleday Duran when Starrett was 42 years old. Seaports was a playful allegory. It was the story of what happens from a bottle of water taken from the Fountain of Youth by Ponce de Leon, and what happens as that bottle travels throughout the ages. Starrett hoped it would become as popular as the works of other writers of playful allegories like James Branch Cabell, Ambrose Bierce, or Christopher Morley. It did not. Seaports languished on bookshelves, and Starrett's love of blending historical and literary creations was set aside, but he never completely let it go. Let's jump ahead a few years. In 1930, Starrett started work on another book, which once again blended history and fiction, tossing them in a blender and using this time his hero, Sherlock Holmes. With its publication in 1933, he helped create a new way of talking about Holmes and the Holmes characters that was childlike but not childish. Starrett would have, for the first time and only time in his life, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes would be his international bestseller. It would be a book that would be remembered for decades and is still read with pleasure today. When Holmes fanatics, Sherlockians, we call ourselves, talk about their playful fascination, we often say, when it comes to Sherlock Holmes, there is a fine line between fact and fiction. We're here to erase the line. This book, laid the foundation for those literary hijinks. One of the biggest fans of Private Life of Sherlock Holmes was Christopher Morley, a New York writer who was far more famous in his day than Vincent Starrett was. He was already a Holmes devotee. Morley started a group of Holmes aficionados called the Baker Street Irregulars. Starrett was a founding member, and most of the early members credit Starrett's book, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, with helping to inspire their devotion. The Baker Street Irregulars, we've just celebrated our 90th anniversary. And one of the inspirations for the Baker Street Irregulars can be traced through Vincent Starrett and back here to Toronto. Let me describe why in greater detail. While Grandfather Young's Bookshop played a vital role in Starrett's bibliophilic journey, it was far from the only influence. There were two other important people in Starrett's Toronto life we need to meet. As I mentioned earlier, Charlie Starrett's family moved to Chicago when he was 4, but every summer for the next 10 years, he returned, and he would stay with the 2 women he later affectionately called the WGA, or the world's greatest aunts, Bella and Lillian Starrett. Naturally, they were from his fun-loving Starrett side of the family. His younger brothers would come and join with them, but everybody knew Charlie was Bella and Lillian's favorite. Many years later, he recalled that the 2 had kept him in pocket money when he was young. They even left him a small inheritance when they passed away in the 1940s. They loved him, and he loved them in return. Dear old ladies, they were the salt of the earth, and they meant more to me than I shall ever be able to say. Bella and Lillian were sentimental to an absurd degree, something that rubbed off on the young Charlie. He also picked up on their habit of speaking their minds with devastating wit. The 2 old ladies were broke with local convention. They never married. They loved charging around town on their own bikes. And even worse, they smoked in public. Oh, yes. I wish I had a photo of them to share with you, but I don't. When Charlie grew up and became a professional writer by the name of Vincent Starrett, he returned their affection by giving them his greatest gifts and dedicated 2 of his books to them. A 1922 book of poetry titled Banners in the Dawn was dedicated to the WGA, DGA, LMSBSJ. Translated, it means to the world's greatest aunts, Lillian M. Starrett and Bella J. Starrett. More clearly, he dedicated his 1943 book of sonnets, Autolycus and Limbo, to Lillian and Bella Starrett, all love and gratitude. It was in that book that Starrett first published his sonnet to Sherlock Holmes, the beloved verse 221b. More on that in a bit. As I said, the 2 women doted on their eldest nephew, and Charlie eagerly looked forward to his Toronto summers, where he would explore the city with all the bravado of one of G.A. Henty's boy heroes. Charlie did not have far to go to find his kind of adventure. In his mind, Bella and Lillian's rambling house was his own treasure island, with an attic that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't long before the young Starrett found 200 or 300 old volumes discarded over the years in that attic. He read them all, even though most were not intended for younger eyes. In one such instance, he encountered Beatrice Harraden's 1894 novel, Ships That Pass in the Night, hoping that it would be a sailing adventure, maybe with pirates. It turned out to be a heart-tugging tale of 2 doomed lovers in a tuberculosis ward. And while there is a murder in Maxwell Gray's 1886 novel, The Silence of Dean Maitland, the book itself is far more a tract on the evils of ambition than a detective story. Starrett learned his aunt's eclectic tastes ranged from romance and Gothic novels to tales of suspense and mystery. But in those days, he didn't care about genres. When he was reading books in their Toronto home, he was glimpsing heaven. It was one such summer with the WGA, when Starrett was 10 or so, that he uncovered a battered copy of the Sherlock Holmes stories. No trumpets blared or choirs sang, but it was clear to the lad, even then, that he had pulled something holy from the book pile. I sat down with it on the front steps in a blaze of summer sunshine. My aunts came and went on the porch above me, but in the words of the old biblical writers, I heard them not. I was still reading Sherlock Holmes when the lamps were lit inside the house and I was called to dinner. While he felt transported by these short stories, Starrett acknowledges that he didn't bother to ask if there were any others in the house. It did not occur to me, I suppose, that there could be another such book in the world. Probably I accepted it as something unique and miraculous that would never happen again. Starrett's willingness to accept the adventures as the only stories about Sherlock Holmes was not the common reaction at the time. It's good to recall that by the 1890s, Sherlock Holmes had become a household name in Toronto, Chicago, London, and much of what was called then the civilized world. The birth and success of Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle's detective had already become a well-known story of its own. I should tell you about this clip. I love research. I don't like writing as much, but I love doing the research. I came across this clipping in the research. As you can see, it's from the 1894 Toronto Evening Star. And there are some things on it that you might not be able to read. Some of the writing might be very small. You see the illustration of Conan Doyle there. Above it is a line that says, "Dr. Doyle is a giant in size. He looks to be about 6'4" and is not at all slim." I think that's Canadian polite for saying he looked fat. You'll also notice that the writer says, the audience was a Sherlock Holmes Conan Doyle one. Notice who comes first. Not the author, but the creation. When Conan Doyle visited Toronto in 1894 as part of his North American speaking tour, he had already pitched Holmes into the Reichenbach Falls in a tale he hopefully titled The Final Problem. The reading public was not pleased. One fan started her angry letter with the words, "You brute!" By the time Charlie discovered Sherlock Holmes in the summer of 1896, the detective was still believed to be dead. Conan Doyle was adamant about not resurrecting the Baker Street detective and had moved on to writing the historical romance novels he hoped would become his most famous works. Sherlock Holmes would star in The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1901, but that was clearly a pre-Reichenbach tale. It would not be until 1903 that Conan Doyle would reluctantly resurrect his detective, and Starrett would wait until the 19-teens to once again take up his pursuit of the British detective, but that's a tale for another day. This is an undated photo of the Starrett family. The original is very, very small, so that's the best reproduction we can get. You see Vincent standing up there in the back. I call him Vincent because he looks almost the age of a man. Anyone want to care about how old he is then? I figure him to be in his mid to later teens, maybe 15, 16, something like that. So that would have been the period after he had stopped coming here to Toronto. This is the last known photo of the entire Starrett family. You have Margaret, then you have Stanley in the background, then Charlie, Vincent Starrett, Polk sitting down, Harold, and baby Robert. Charlie's trips to Toronto became less frequent as he grew to his later teens, but the city's influence did not end. He never entirely let go of the inner child, hunting through the books in his grandfather's bookshop or in his aunt's attic. Charlie knew exactly what he wanted at the center of his life: rows and rows of books to call his own. After all, he is the man who said, "When we are collecting books, we are collecting happiness." As an adult, Starrett not only collected books, he also wrote a small library of books, many of them rooted in his early years of reading. This is all the books of poetry that Vincent Starrett published during the course of his lifetime. His aunt's romance books would spark the poet in his soul, prompting him to dedicate verses to beautiful women who would inevitably break his heart. He also wrote poems to his favorite fictional heroes: Long John Silver, D'Artagnan, Falstaff, Pickwick, and Don Quixote. Most of all, the Sherlock Holmes canon would inspire him to write his own detective stories featuring Jimmy Lavender, who used Sherlockian-like techniques to solve crimes among the rich and privileged in Chicago. He also wrote a series of moderately successful mystery novels during the 1930s to offset the failure of Studies, Seaports and the Moon. These are just a small part of his output. As an adult, Vincent never forgot that first meeting with Sherlock Holmes here in Toronto. More importantly, he looked back on that moment at his aunt's house and realized just how important it was in his writing career. In 1966, when he was 80 years of age, he spoke to Chicago's premier group of art supporters known as the Cliff Dwellers. Although he had written about his Toronto experiences with Holmes in his memoir, he visited the experience once again, and like most memories, it got better with time. We don't have a recording of the talk, but there are notes for it tucked into a folder in the University of Minnesota's Anderson Library archive. Here's how he remembered his first meeting with Holmes. "I first met Sherlock Holmes on a doorstep in Toronto. I was perhaps 10. That would have been about 1896, and I assume the book I was reading to have been an early printing of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, discovered in the family bookcase. I was reading at random, and as it happened, chanced first on that hair-raising episode called The Speckled Band, which I opened speculatively somewhere in the middle. A little later, with pounding pulse, I hurried back to the beginning to read what was gone before. Ultimately, I must have looked at the title page and read for the first time that thrilling caption, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. What incredible luck to have stumbled onto such a book in one's formative years. But it aged me. I emerged from its pages a changed man, realizing I would never see 10 again, or ever care to return to the pious little moralities which my bookseller grandfather urged on me with crafty generosity. At that moment, I began a career of Conan Doyle idolatry that I am happy to say still flourishes. Yes, even at 80. I have no idea how many thousands of words I've written about the Sherlock Holmes legend, but the fact is I could scarcely write a paragraph on any subject without bringing Holmes into the argument. Charles Vincent Emerson Starrett died in his adopted city of Chicago on January 5, 1974. He was 87. In looking back through that long life, it's clear to me that this city had a profound impact on Vincent Starrett. He was shaped by Toronto's people, its institutions, its reverence for books and reading, a quality which is still celebrated in this very building. As you've heard, Starrett never forgot the experiences he had here as a boy, walking the city's gaslit streets, hearing the horses as they marched up and down its thoroughfares, and finding the undying spirits of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Perhaps those memories helped when the time came to write his best-known poem. Starrett had been writing poetry since he was a teen, and while his detective stories, mystery novels, and Sherlock Holmes writings were far more popular, he always considered himself a poet first. Poetry allowed him to express deep emotions he couldn't release in his other works. It's no surprise that he turned to poetry when he had to wrestle with the German raids known as the Blitz. In the spring of 1942, London and much of England had been the victim of a devastating series of German aerial raids. The Blitz not only hurt England's ability to build and fly planes, it also destroyed or damaged many of the landmarks that had been so familiar to the world. Starrett, who had walked London's old city and had strolled along Baker Street, was devastated by the destruction. Like so many, he feared the bravery and valor of the British people would soon flag, and that civilization, as he and they knew it, would go up in flames. Starrett had experienced the world of ghostly gas lamps and lonely hansoms splashing through the rain while living here in Toronto. The books he read as a boy instilled in him a pride of the British people, their fortitude, their determination. If you're a fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories, there are many passages you probably know by heart. For example, Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. But there's likely only one poem about Sherlock Holmes that you would know. The sonnet is more than 80 years old, yet for the friends of Sherlock Holmes, it remains as powerful today as it was the day Starrett rolled it out of his typewriter. It's so famous, in fact, that you've painted a portion of it on a city wall as part of the Sherlock Holmes walk. Starrett simply called the sonnet 221B, the address of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson on Baker Street. Eric, let's hear it.
Here dwell together still two men of note, who never lived, and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears attuned to catch the distant view halloo. England is England yet, for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive. and it is always 1895.
Thank you very much. Barbara, are you doing the question Q&A? Okay, cool.
That was wonderful, Ray. Just wonderful. I'll thank you to a greater degree after we do the Q&A. I want to say how grateful, though, we are. I was listening to what you had to say, Ray, that like Mark Twain, reports of Vincent Starrett's death, at least in the case of his birth, were much exaggerated. And I love the quote, when we are collecting books, we are collecting happiness. As a collector, I believe that when we collect anything, we are collecting happiness. So I believe that. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Ray? Cliff.
If you are asking a question, we'll bring you the microphone. So Vincent Starrett was known as one of the greatest of American bookmen. And I told you I was going to ask you, what exactly is a bookman?
So, as a matter of fact, Peter Ruber published a book about Vincent Starrett in 1968, and it's called The Last Bookman. Bookman is generally described as someone who not only collects books, but has a real affinity, a love for them, treasures them, talks about them, writes about them, and tries to get other people involved in their world. As I said, Starrett had huge collections, not just of Vincent Starrett. He collected, at one point, he was collecting along 13 different lines, he said. And a line could be the works of just Dickens, or a line could be all mystery writers. He had a huge number of books. He was an amazing bookman, book lover, book collector. He was a lousy accountant. His father had a penchant for the bottle. Starrett announces pretty clearly he was addicted to buying books, and he simply could not stop. He was buying books. I have a letter where he starts out the letter to the book dealer saying, "I simply cannot be buying any more books anymore. I'm very sorry about this. And oh, by the way, do you have that one volume I was asking about the other?" He could not stop himself. That, I think, is a bookman. Someone who perhaps goes in even a little over his head and in the family finances in buying books. Those of us who have little collections of books have some affinity for that, I think, some feeling for what that's like. And our poor spouses who have to put up with us. Yes. Yeah. By the way, we retired 3 years ago. We moved back to Williamsburg, Virginia, where my son and his family live. At the time, my 9-year-old granddaughter came into the room that I call the library, and she looked at me and she said, "Grandpap, how many Sherlock Holmes books do you have?" And I said, "I don't know, Elizabeth. Why don't you count them?" She stopped at 500. She could have kept counting. She's very, very good at math, far better than Vincent Starrett ever was. But she got tired and wandered off to do something else. Anything else?
I know that he didn't travel out of Chicago because of his wife, but before all that, did he ever make it back to Toronto as an adult?
Yeah. Oh, yes. He came up here. There are letters where he thanks family members for hosting him when he came up here. He and his first wife came here, I believe, to introduce his wife to the family. He has a rather spooky poem about the fact that he woke up one morning and realized that he and his wife were sleeping in the bed that his grandfather had died in. So yeah, he was here, but he did come back, not as often as he would have liked. His first wife, he and his first wife were not a good match. They were separated for quite a few years. He and his second wife, he loved her dearly. Rachel, he called her Ray, had severe emotional issues, attempted suicide, was in a state mental institution for quite a few years. She feared every time he left town that he was going to leave her, so he did not leave town very often. He attended one meeting of the Baker Street Irregulars, the first meeting in June 1934. Never went back to the BSI meeting again. But he started a Sherlock Holmes group in Chicago called the Hounds of the Baskerville, sick. And they became the Chicago Irregulars, and so that was his home Holmes group.
I know with my own research on Starrett that it's just a bit of information, but he was a reporter, and at one point during his career, he took over writing book reviews in, I believe it was the Chicago Tribune. I could be wrong on that. And the thing was, he would always tell somebody, "Oh yeah, I can write a review about your book. Send me a copy." And when I heard that, I reported that to the bookmakers years ago. And at the end, I said, "Sneaky, Vincent, a good way to get your books for your own library."
Get books for free. That's absolutely right. He wrote a weekly column for the Chicago Tribune for about 25 years. He was never an employee of the Tribune. He was a freelancer, but he worked on a regular basis. His first job was as a reporter. He worked for newspapers in Chicago called the Chicago Inter-Ocean, and the second one was the Chicago Daily News. Yeah, but he was a reporter in those days. He was a picture picker. So in those days, that was kind of an entry-level position, and his job was to go into the homes of someone who had been murdered and find a photograph of the dead person so that they could use it in the next day's newspaper. So, you know, if you want to learn about police techniques, if you want to learn how to get around the police, if you want to learn how to break into a building, I mean, these were all practical experiences that Vincent Starrett had that he would put then into his mystery and his detective stories. The creepiest one was when he climbed in through a window. It was a bedroom window, turned and looked at the bed, and the dead woman was there. Her head was over here, and her body was over there. He turned and climbed back out the window again.
You show quite a few books in the pictures that Starrett wrote. Are they from your own collection of more than 500?
Yeah, so all those books that you saw up there, when I'm checking, yes, I'll mentally check, yes, those are all from my collection. Many of those books you could find here, by the way. If you wanted to read Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, if you want to read 221B, which he edited, if you want to read his books of poetry, the library has them. And if you ask very nicely, you may be able to have the opportunity to read them.
Thank you for bringing to our attention that he was such a prolific writer. I didn't realize he had such an output.
He did. He really did. Yeah, that was his bread and butter. He, in fact, wrote at one period in the 19-teens. He had written so many Jimmy Lavender detective short stories that the editors told him to stop because they had a backlog of his work and they couldn't publish them fast enough. He was writing them faster than they could be published, but he was feeding not only at the time his first wife Lillian and himself and paying their bills, but he was also feeding his collecting mania, and he had to try to keep selling stories so that he could keep buying books.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the first purchase that the library made back in 1969 that led to a decision to have a Conan Doyle collection came from a Toronto insurance executive named Bailey, and not related to the Bailey Special Collections Center as far as I know. And a lot of them were books by Vincent Starrett. And what Bailey used to do, in the old days people did this, they would take a book and they would put it in the mail to the author and ask the author, I think they included a return container of some kind, and they would ask the author to sign it. So a lot of the Starrett's books, which are in the collection today, actually are autographed by him, which is kind of interesting because not too many libraries have that kind of a collection.
Yeah, it actually turned out to be a problem in his first marriage because Vincent Starrett started getting fan mail, and his first wife thought these were his girlfriends writing to him. And so he started getting his fan mail at one of the bookshops in town where he went every single day, and they just held his mail like as if he lived there, and he would come by every day, and he would pick it up, and then, of course, he would buy a book and walk out. Yeah, yeah.
I think it was you, Ray, that said, I think it was you, Ray, that said, I could be wrong, but didn't you say, somebody said, if you collect Vincent Starrett books he didn't sign, they're more rare than ones he did sign?
There are a lot of signed Vincent Starrett books out there. That is very true. There are a lot of books with Vincent Starrett's signatures in them. If you want to understand the distinction, see me afterwards and I'll explain it to you. Had enough? Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cliff offered me a lawyer's minute, okay?
Here.
I think it was about 2012. Ray was editing a BSI book on the dancing men, and he included an article I wrote, which I'm still dining out on, and it got me started. And about 8 or 9 years later, I had the privilege, the honor, and the pleasure of being Ray's editor for when I was co-editing Magic Door, and I made some copies of the issue, and if someone would like one, I'd be glad to hand them out. I only have so many, but if I'm short, you can give me your email address, and I will email you the PDF. And I just want to say, it's a fine article. It's a damn fine article.
How much do I owe you for that?
Did I get it right?
You-
No,
you-
okay.
He said that exactly the way I wrote it. He really did, yes.
One thing I found of interest, the rabbi at my synagogue, knowing that I was a Sherlockian, once mentioned that he lived in the same apartment building as Vincent Starrett in Chicago, and that he was a very nice man. He remembered him very fondly. Yeah. Well, I think we're all agreed that if Vincent Starrett reminded us why we are all in awe of Sherlock Holmes, Ray Betzner has confirmed enthusiastically and insightfully our everlasting indebtedness to Vincent Starrett. Thank you, Ray, for giving us so much of the backstory, not just of Starrett's reverence for our iconic detective, but the significant part that Toronto played in his formative years, and how the private life of Vincent Starrett led to both the private life of Sherlock Holmes and to that seminal verse in which he lives forever in 1895. Erasing, as you say, the line between Vincent Starrett and Sherlock Holmes. What incredible luck that Starrett stumbled upon Sherlock Holmes and that Ray Betzner stumbled upon Vincent Starrett. Thank you so much, Ray.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Unless you don't know me, my name is Philip Elliott. I'm with the Friends as both the secretary/merchandise person. But my duty here this afternoon is to present Ray with a thank you gift on behalf of everybody here and the Friends for his wonderful lecture, his dedication to Vincent, dedication to Sherlock Holmes, obviously, and to thank him for being here. So what I have here is one of the Jubilee bags that we had here a couple of years ago, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Bootmakers and the Friends collection. So there are little goodies in there, and I'll tell you what some of them are. Some of them are Friends pens. We've got in this yellow plastic bag, we have 2 posters. One of them is a poster that was done for one of our conferences, and it is the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles. The other one is a poster of William Gillette as Sherlock Holmes. I would just strongly recommend when you take them out to put them underneath something because they've been round up for a couple of years. We also have a book, a play by Barbara Rush that she signed for you this afternoon. We have a CD of The Hound of the Baskervilles that was done for our 100th anniversary of the Hound of the Baskervilles conference we had here. Plus, we have a special gift, which I'm going to take out and show everybody. I tell you, as merchandise person, it's getting hard trying to figure out gifts for speakers. So what we have here, we have a mug, and on one side, we have a picture taken from the internet of Vincent Starrett. On the other side, this was Plan B, is the poem itself, 221B. The original plan was, hopefully, if we had a poster of this meeting, to have the poster on the back here to memorialize this meeting. But because we didn't have a poster, and I had this as a digital copy, that was my plan B. Yeah. So we hope you enjoy having coffee, tea, whatever beverage with Vincent. And just to make sure you never forget his poem, it's going to be on the opposite side.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And before I go, I just want to I have another mug here. Now, originally, I got involved with Vincent Starrett through one of the Bootmaker members, George Vanderbilt. Now, I have a mug for George, and unfortunately he's not here. And once the post office opens up again, we're going to send him a mug. I have a second mug here, and I'm going to ask Hartley to come up and accept this mug because from what he told us at the Friends Executive, he was the one who put the buzz in George's ear, who put the buzz in my ear. And so, Hartley, we're giving you a mug that has a picture of Vincent Starrett on it. We can't give you one that has the poem on it because that's a special one for Ray. But we hope you will accept this and enjoy every time you have a cup of coffee or something, you enjoy it with Vincent. And we have the same mug for George, which we will email him.
Thank you very much, Philip. Many years ago, I was sitting at a lecture on the weekend with Sherlock Holmes when they decided that they would have, at the old library, they did a little lecture on the detectives before Sherlock Holmes, etc. I'm sitting with a man by the name of Eric Silk, who was then commissioner of the OPP. He says, wouldn't it be a good idea to start a Sherlock Holmes Society in Toronto? This is not a bad idea. We went out for lunch, we came back, and then Cameron Hollier passed around some membership forms and said, we're starting a society. So I was at the first meeting, Cliff was at the second meeting, and happily to say that I am the maybe two people still standing who are members of founders. I'm one of them, and I think I'm still standing. But many years later, I got an invitation from a friend of mine, Toy Beaumillion, who was a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, and he said, we got a conference of coroners coming up. We need a speaker. So what did I know about dead people? So I said, okay, what do you want me to speak on medicine? So I found an old lecture, Sherlock Holmes in Medicine, and sort of Conan Doyle. I said, okay, I'll speak. And then some guy kept asking a bunch of questions. I said, who are you? So it was our friend, sorry, who are we talking about here? George. And he said, is there a Sherlock Holmes Society around? I said, come and I gave him the form. He became a very prominent member. He declined in later years, but he kept on supplying books, etc. So I can be thanked for that too. And thank you particularly for this great honor. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Reminder to, if you haven't, take a walk out. When you go out to the library, make a left turn at the corner, walk to the end of the block, and you'll see Sherlock Holmes Walk. And go upstairs and have a look at some of the treasures of the collection and get an idea of just the beauty of the room itself. It's unique, especially in this building, which is of a style that's called brutalist. And you can go back from brutalist into Victorian. Anyway, thank you very much, and we are adjourned.